Greetings, friends, and welcome to Live at 3:45. I'm delighted today to have as our guest Jean Kilheffer Hess, who is the Executive Director of the Mennonite Historical Society, or the Lancaster Mennonite Historical Society. Jean, welcome. It's so good to have you here, and thank you for joining us today.
I'm happy to be here.
The question I'm going to ask you, Jean, is the one that I typically ask as we get started, is what do you see God doing? What do you see God, where do you see God at work in the world, the church, God's kingdom, from your perspective, however you want to share that with us?
Seems to me that we are living in a context that incentivizes reaction. And not just reaction, but immediate reaction, a very quick domino effect from seeing, experiencing, then judging and reacting. And with a deluge of information, headlines, choices, opportunities, or lack of opportunities every day, we make snap judgments and quick assumptions. And some of this, I think, is just plain survival in an information age. Some of it has to do with brain conditioning as a result of engaging with social media, or it's just maybe the result of giving too much weight to those click-hungry news headlines that are crafted to elicit outrage. And I think within churches in the Anabaptist movement in the US, it seems we're often also swimming in anxiety. In traditionalist cultures, it's anxiety that maybe that things are changing. In progressive cultures, it's anxiety that things aren't changing fast enough. But rarely do we seem self-aware about our fear. And I think we often unknowingly project that fear or look through a lens of fear and project it onto others. So I see, as I look around, God calling the church to get curious instead of critical, to slow down, to notice, and to learn before jumping to conclusions and reacting. And also to find joy along the way. We're not talking much about joy these days, and I think that's a conversation that's important. Anabaptists, of course, are third-way people, and we got this way by seeing past that 2D facade to the richness of life beyond choice A or choice B. We got this way in a community together. And so I think it's helpful for us to right now think, how do we move from fear-based reactivity to a place of being open and grounded in this beloved community that we have together? Still, of course, doing the important work of welcoming God's shalom and doing so, though, with confidence that we're joining the Spirit's creative work already transforming the world. I believe it involves getting curious about what we notice in the everyday experiences that we have, to really see what's before us, to stop, to acknowledge it, to discipline ourselves instead of reacting, to ask one good objective question that sets us on a journey of discovering the story beyond what we might otherwise quickly judge. I've been playing a bit with a concept, and it's from the world of wine and winemaking as a metaphor for noticing and entering into the stories of our own lives and also the lives of others. When a person with a discriminating palate tastes a wine, they detect certain notes that point to the story behind the wine. The wine's terroir, T-E-R-R-O-I-R, refers to the unique aspects it has due to the specific land and the climate that the grapes were grown on. There are as many unique wines as there are plots of land and environments capable of growing grapes. So what if we began recognizing the sharp and the sweet and the nutty notes of the everyday as growing from the terroir of the past? What if we became practiced at reserving our judgment and following the hints of a storyline we detect instead? That very practice of learning those stories that shape us in our communities is the practice of history. And as Conrad mentioned, I'm executive director of Lancaster Mennonite Historical Society in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And I'm so grateful to be able to serve the church by helping it notice in that sip of communion wine a broader story. If we see them and value them, everyday moments are really what life is made of. I'm going to show a few photos. These are actually from the Mennonite Church USA Archives collection that are easily available online that give a glimpse into the everyday of Mennonite lives from the past. Here's an example of a simple scene that I might be tempted to think I know what's going on in without needing to ask any specific questions. This is Miriam Zimmerman and her little sister Irma sitting outside in New Holland, Pennsylvania on July 20th, 1949. Miriam is knitting a sock set for an infant because she's a businesswoman selling her products at market in Lancaster. What question might you ask of this image? Other than what are they doing in a cemetery? This is a group of cyclists participating in a bicycle ministry called Outspoken that was sponsored by Mennonite Board of Missions. They're having devotions at a stop along their route from Harmon, West Virginia to Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and this is in 1976. Here's a familiar scene, Mennonites working together. These are men working on the new voluntary service unit house in Glenwood Springs, Colorado in 1960. On the roof is Ray Yoder of Wolford, North Dakota. And below him, left to right, are James Durstein of Lansdale, Pennsylvania, Bill Mast of Thomas, Oklahoma, Orville Troyer of Elkhart, Indiana, and John Lehman of Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Again, these are everyday moments, things that illuminate Mennonite life and highlight how people work together and enjoy and engage with the world around them. Some of those dates that I mentioned were highly stressful times. Mennonite communities have been navigating anxiety and the world around them since the beginning. If you're inclined to slow down and practice noticing the everyday, if you'd like to share what you've learned as a result of curious questions and following the story, I also want to introduce you to Anabaptist History Today. It's a community storytelling project supported by 16 Anabaptist archives and history organizations. And with an easy upload, you can offer your everyday and also learn the experiences of others. I will share a glimpse of Anabaptist History Today as well. This is the stories page, and you can see that it's a place for folks to capture that every day, to talk about what they're noticing within themselves and within the world. And this was begun specifically during COVID, but it is a place for storytelling well beyond the experience of COVID. These items will be digitally archived, and when future generations want to learn what it was like living during this decade, this is one way that they can learn. It's possible to upload these stories in Spanish through a Spanish input form. Also, of course, we have it in English. And you can see that many of the stories come from places around the US and Canada. But we're also starting to welcome and getting stories from Anabaptist and what we might call Anabaptish communities around the world. You don't have to be directly part of a Mennonite congregation, but if you feel connected with the Anabaptist story, you're welcome to submit. Knowing that we're connected and not alone, that God's Spirit is with us, can go a long way to finding joy on a journey. Even this journey, whatever that journey is for each of us today. So those are my sort of prepared reflections about what I'm seeing in the church and in the world, in the place where I'm ministering through historical connections.
Jean, thank you. Do you want to say anything about how we practice this? How do you see people practicing taking these moments, observing these moments, and connecting them with history? It sounds like a discipline of some sort almost.
Yeah, it seems to me that it's the kind of thing that we do together. So one thing I notice when it comes to many things, whether it's what we're talking about in this case or any kind of goal that an individual has, there's often the storyline, either I'm just getting started in this practice or I'd like to start a new practice, but you don't often engage with folks who are able to sustain a practice for a long time without having a shared community that's working on that together. So I think some of the ways that we can help each other learn how to notice and to step back from reactivity is to sort of thread in our everyday conversations some curious questions. So when I'm engaging with someone and I or they seem to be coming from a place of anxiety or reactivity or very much focused in on what appears to be a particular lens that's not helping us view the world more broadly, asking those curious questions of ourselves or of others in that one-to-one conversation, I think can be really helpful. And then of course, finding ways that group settings, whether that's in a congregation proper, whether it's in a book club group, or some other way where we feel trusting and connected and can help each other grow. And then follow that storyline. This is what I'm hearing. This is what I'm noticing about experiencing this engagement. Tell me more about how you experienced that or where that assumption came from. And are you aware of, if there is a historical backstory, bringing each other that gift, are you aware of how this grew out of a particular experience, maybe in this congregation, maybe in this town, maybe in a family system that we're aware of a story.
So Jean, have Mennonites been good at this over our history? I mean, is this a practice, or is knowing what you do about our history, how have we done with this?
Well, you would think Mennonites would be very practiced at this, considering that when we make our baptismal vows, we agree to give and receive counsel, right? And one of the gifts we can give each other is these stories and these connections with the past and what we've learned along the way. I don't know that I've particularly observed that Mennonites are great at it. And part of that, I think, has to do with I don't know what it comes from, but maybe a bit of personal touchiness. I've observed that in organizational settings and also in individual congregational settings, we don't often have the confidence to hear with carefully objective ears. Sometimes we pull back into a defensive posture instead of welcoming sort of that broader understanding.
I think you're right. I've talked in my podcast about the insecurity of the church, but it's anxiety, as you've talked about, and I own that too. I mean, as a pastor, I've certainly experienced that, and it seems, as I've said in the podcast, it's easier for that to happen in a classroom it feels like, than it is, in a congregation. And I've often wondered how we make that transition to do what you're describing, so that we feel less threatened in the congregational context and are able to be curious with one another, because I think that's a wonderful practice.
Yeah, I think sometimes we, for whatever reason, mistake conversation for confrontation, particularly in a more maybe Swiss German kind of cultural background. And I'm not sure what that comes from, but we need to, open ourselves up to conversation being simply that, a way of exploring together the world and our experiences and each other.
I teach sociology of religion periodically, and I had students last time I taught it do a paper and a presentation on their religious story, whether they were religious or not. I mean, so they could tell a non-religious story, but within the context of they all had grown up in this country where they knew something about religion. And I was struck with how they listened to one another and how they influenced one another. So I had evangelical students sharing their story, so then a student who was agnostic or an atheist telling their story. And it was interesting, the story, the student who identified as an atheist said at the end, after hearing all of these stories, maybe I can think about God again. And it was just interesting to me that in that safe context, it was almost an evangelistic opportunity. I mean, but it was because it was what you have said. It was, we were curious about each other's stories, not threatened by them, and they influenced one another in what I think is a really positive way. And I came away from that saying, that's what I would love to see more of in the church. That kind of listening that I think you're talking about, that everyday practice of paying attention to and being curious about.
Yeah, our vision that we're moving towards at Lancaster Mennonite Historical Society is learning our own and each other's stories across boundaries. And I can imagine a time and place in our world where the church may get to the point where we can model that we can actually listen and share stories. And at the end of it, maybe say, now I'm open to new connection again, regarding maybe a relationship that was broken, or because of hearing your story, I'm crossing those boundaries that society has sort of created between us, and recognizing that we're all in this together. It's really about trust, right? And vulnerability.
Yeah. It is, which is not cultivated easily in the current context in which we're living. But it's really this was really the intent that I had behind this live at 3:45. And this Facebook group was that we're collaborating together and listening and paying attention together. And there's been this amazing overlap. I'm thinking of a couple of other individuals who spoke, who shared. Lucy Krug, a student at Elizabethtown College, who did a lot of poetry on the program, paying attention to everyday things. I'm thinking about just on Monday, Hank Stenvers from the Netherlands, talking about centered set and bounded set. And that maybe it's when the bounded set, the boundaries are gone, that we can, in new ways, practice church and around the scripture together. And so I appreciate a lot what you brought, because I think it reminds us of, there's a kind of theme developing here of listening to God, of listening to one another, and God's voice through us, our voices together. So I really appreciate what you brought.
And finding that bit of confidence, particularly as we recognize the multi-woven thread that has been history and that is connected to us and carries us in some ways. Sometimes, of course, the history is painful history that needs to be dealt with. And in other ways, it's really incredible resilience that we can recognize from forebears and from other stories of other communities that are nearby and far away. So, yeah. There's a lot of joy in that too, once we can find that groundedness, even in the midst of what sometimes feels like chaos.
There is, because we all are human beings I like to say we all have the imprint of God upon us. And in so many ways, we all need the same things. We need compassion and care and grace and love and belonging. And yeah, and listening to one another helps us, I think, get to those places easier. Thank you, Jean. I really appreciate the emphasis on this practice and also the way it captures what I think we're trying to do here on Live at 345. So thank you for your work too on behalf of the church, and may God bless you and continue to lead you. And this can be found on Facebook and on YouTube and on my podcast in about half an hour. So thank you, Jean. God's blessing.
You're welcome. Blessings.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.